Hi everyone, I wanted to use this video to talk about the concept of this in JavaScript. And I'm sorry, but this video is going to get really confusing with all the times I'm talking about this. So if I'm talking about this, then please know that I'm talking about the object this. Okay, so this is kind of an OOP type concept, but it's also used a lot in functional programming. It basically just allows an object to refer to itself. So if you're instantiating a new object and you say this, then the object knows that you're referring to itself. And the reason I wanted to record this video is because this can get very confusing when you're coding. Basically, there are lots of different ways of using functions from within objects, and the object this and the part of the page or the function or the code that this is scoped to can change depending on how you're calling it or how you're referencing it. And it's important to know how it can change with different ways of referring to it and how that could impact your code, because you might lose the this that you're referring to. And this video is already confusing, so I'm sorry. Okay, so say I have an object here called my object. It has a key called foo, which is equal to the value bar, and a key called baz, which is equal to a function. And all that function does is it console logs a statement to do with this, the object this. So I put this statement in here, this ternary statement in, saying if this is equal to the global scope object, then just print global object / window, because otherwise we'll get a huge object printing out in the terminal and it'll be really confusing. Okay, so the reason I have this statement in is because in this case, the object this can either refer to the myObject object, or it can refer to the global object, or if you're running this in a browser, the window object, depending on how you call or how you reference this. So for example here, if we're directly calling myObject.baz, so this function, if we call this function, it will refer to the myObject object. However, if we make a new variable called myfunc and set that equal to myObject.baz, then this function loses what this was referring to originally. And so it ends up referring to the global object rather than to the original scope of this, which was my object, which was what you were wanting it to refer to. Okay, I have a few other statements here, but I just want to run this in the browser just to show you quickly. So if I say node this.js, okay, so we're looking at these top two statements here. So this is an object foo bar baz function. This is an object global object / window. So you can see how the value of this has changed between these two different ways of calling or referencing this function. So I want to talk to you about three other types of functions here called .call, .apply, and .bind. And what these functions do, these are inbuilt functions, and they can change the value of this. So you can use these functions. So I used bind in my last video about React to retain the value of this when I called one of my functions in my React app. So it can be useful to have these functions if you want to retain a previous version of the this object, or if you want to pass in a new version of the this object. So here, call and apply are both immediately executed functions. So when you call these two functions, they'll run straight away and return straight away. The only difference between call and apply is they both take a new object here that gives a new value for this, but they also both take arguments for the function as well, but they take them in different ways. So .call functions take the arguments just listed normally, like normal parameters in a function, whereas if you're using .apply, you have to list whatever arguments you're passing in an array, and then apply takes them and separates them out and passes them in like normal parameters. Okay, so if you call either of these two functions, so .call, .apply, when you call them on myObject.baz, then it'll change the value of this from that object to whatever you're passing in here, so A1 or A2, and you can see that in the terminal here, they've already printed out this is an object A1, A2 here. So it's changed the value of the this object. So if I go to bind, bind is slightly different. You can't call it immediately. You have to store it in a function and call that. So I have here my func2 is equal to my object.baz.bind, and then I'm passing in a new this object here, which is a is equal to 3. And then I'm calling my func2. What bind does is, in addition to taking a new object for this, it takes a function and changes it and returns a slightly altered version of that function. So you can see here when I call the myfunc2, it's giving me back this is an object A3. Just to demonstrate how bind works, I've written my own kind of version of bind called mybind. So function mybind, it takes a function, which in this case is myObject.baz, and it takes a new value of this. And what it does is it returns an anonymous function that returns function or func that you passed in dot apply, so the same as up here, and it takes the value of this, so the new this object, and also any arguments that you might want to pass into that function as well. And that's what it returns. It returns this new function with apply called on it with a new value of this added to that. So say I've stored this mybind function into a variable called bound function. So I call mybind, I have to call it just like a normal function. It's not like .call or .apply because I've written this myself. So mybind, and I'm passing in myObject.baz, and then a is equal to 4 for the new scope of this. And then when I call bound function, you can see in the terminal, it prints out this is an object A4. So those are just some different ways that the value of this can change during your code, and also ways that you can change this. So next I wanted to talk about ES6. So ES6 has introduced these things called arrow functions. Arrow functions change the way that this object is scoped. So if we have myObject2, it's exactly the same as the first myObject. So foo is equal to bar, baz is this time equal to an arrow function, which console logs this is a, and then the object this. So in ES6, arrow functions, the this object in arrow functions refers to the parent. So in Node, that happens to be the module exports object, whereas in the browser, it would probably be the global object or the window object. So basically, rather than when you originally called myObject.baz with a normal function at the top, and it would give you the myObject object back for this, when you call this with an arrow function, it returns the module exports object because it's going off the parent scope, and so the parent of this object is the window basically, or it would be if this was inside another function, it would be referring, or another object, it would be referring to that object. So just to show you, I have exactly the same functions as I had above. So you know, myObject.baz is stored in a variable, or .call, .apply, .bind. Just to show you, they all give you exactly the same thing back again, except they haven't. Oh, because I didn't save the file, right. If I save the file and try running it again, this is an object module exports, because I didn't want to print out the module exports object because that's currently an empty object. So you can see that if you're using arrow functions or ES6 syntax, then if you're not careful, this can refer to your module exports in Node or your window if you're running the code in the browser. Okay. However, arrow functions can be useful and they can help you refer to the right value of this. So in this case, I'm using a set timeout function to just console log the same type of thing as I had above. But in the first object, myObject3, I'm calling set timeout with an arrow function. And in the second, myObject4, I'm calling set timeout just as a normal ES5 anonymous function. So when you call myObject3.foo2, which is this function, and myObject4.foo3, which is this function, I think I messed up my naming a little bit here, it's getting a bit confusing. So in the first case, because setTimeout is the one that's calling this anonymous function, this is going to refer to the parent of setTimeout, and because setTimeout is inside this function here, which is under the foo2 key, this is going to refer to myObject3. Whereas in myObject4, setTimeout is calling the function, but because it's not an arrow function, it just refers to the function that it's inside. This is scoped to the function that's calling it. So it actually returns a timeout object, which is quite strange. So here you can see myObject3.foo2, because I just put a console log here so we can see what we're referring to. So we get back object foo2 function, whereas myObject4.foo3 gives me object timeout, which is the weird timeout object that's returned by the setTimeout function. So you can see in this case, using an arrow function actually helped us to retain the scope of this that we wanted. Okay, so finally, I just wanted to cover a tiny little bit of some OOP, because this is used a lot. This is used a lot in OOP. Okay, so we have just a function here called myCar, and we console log this, which should be an empty object, and then we add this.x, a new key equal to 1, and then console log this again, which will give us an object, this time containing x is equal to 1. So now we've instantiated two new versions of this class. So we have car1 and car2. So if I just comment this out for a second and save the file, if I run it, you can see we get back my car, empty object, my car, x1, and then the same again because we've instantiated the class twice. So it looks like they're both referring to the same object, but what you need to know is that in JavaScript, when you use this new keyword, what it does is gives a new scope of this. So if we use this statement here to see whether car1 is equal to car2, whether they both refer to the same this object, and run this code again, you can see false. They're not equal to each other. They both have their own scope of this, this object. And they're both referring to different things. So that's something that you need to pay attention to if you're doing any OOP programming. You need to make sure that you know that each instantiation of your class is referring to its own this object. So I hope this video wasn't too confusing, and I hope you might be able to use some of these examples. And thank you for listening. Bye.